She came to Ashford Hall to teach, but what Florence didn't know was that she would soon hold the heart of a man whose pain ran deeper than anyone could imagine. The Duke's silence shattered as he did the unimaginable. He begged her to never leave. But why? "Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this romantic tale from the past, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face." Florence Francis, a 7-year-old governess, sat stiffly in the hired carriage as it clattered along the winding, uneven country road. The wheels creaked, and the horses' hooves clipped against the cobblestones, each bump sending jolts of unease through her. She clutched the letter of employment in her lap with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety, her slender fingers smoothing over the creases of the paper as if to reassure herself that this new chapter in her life was real. The autumn winds of Derbyshire swept through the open window, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. She looked out at the expansive hills, their soft curves dotted with the occasional stone cottage. The land was breathtakingly beautiful, but to Florence, it felt distant, almost foreign. She had spent the last several years in the quiet countryside of Somerset, teaching at a small school. But now, a new life awaited her, in a grand estate far from everything she had known. The year was 1853, and Florence was about to begin a job that seemed full of promise, but was also fraught with uncertainty. The letter she had received from Duke Clement Alfred of Ashford Hall had been a strange one, brief, almost desperate, offering a generous salary for the role of governess to his daughter, Lady Isabel. Florence had accepted without hesitation, grateful for the opportunity after her previous position had ended under less than ideal circumstances. Her trunk, packed with only a few modest gowns and personal belongings, rested beside her on the seat, its weight a constant reminder of the life she was leaving behind. She swallowed the knot of apprehension that had settled in her throat as the carriage rolled closer to her destination. The estate of Ashford Hall loomed ahead, its silhouette rising against the cloudy sky. "Not much farther now, miss," the coachman called over his shoulder, his voice breaking into Florence's thoughts. "Ashford Hall lies just beyond that ridge." Florence nodded silently, her dark chestnut hair pulled back into a neat bun beneath her modest bonnet. Her green traveling dress, though well made, was a far cry from the fine gowns she had once dreamed of wearing. Her thoughts strayed briefly to the life she had left behind, the teaching position at the modest school she had once loved, the quiet existence that had given her a sense of purpose. She had never expected to be swept into the grand world of the aristocracy, much less to live within the imposing walls of a duke's manor. As the carriage crested the ridge, Florence's breath caught in her throat. Ashford Hall stood before her, a magnificent yet melancholy structure. Its tall stone walls seemed to reach toward the heavens, its towering spires rising from the darkened stone like silent sentinels. The estate was grand, undeniably so, but it carried an air of forlornness that struck Florence instantly. The windows of the manor were large, but seemed to stare out like sorrowful eyes, while the gardens surrounding the estate were wild and untended. The roses in the garden grew rampant, their bright blooms half hidden beneath overgrown ivy and weeds. It was as if the house itself had been left to decay in the shadow of some deep, unspoken sorrow. "There she is," the coachman muttered under his breath as the carriage approached the grand entrance. He pulled the reins, slowing the horses as they came to a stop in front of the massive oak doors. Florence's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly disembarked from the carriage. She steadied herself, smoothing the folds of her dress as she moved toward the doors. Her gaze swept over the estate once more, a mixture of awe and nervousness stirring in her. Ashford Hall was as magnificent as it was imposing, and she could not shake the feeling that something heavy lingered in the air, waiting to be uncovered. Before she could reach for her trunk, the grand doors swung open. A severe-looking woman emerged, her grey hair tightly pulled into a bun, her posture straight as iron. She regarded Florence with a calculating eye before speaking in a tone that suggested little warmth. "Miss Francis, I presume," the woman said, her voice clipped. "I am Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper of Ashford Hall. You are expected." Florence nodded politely, though she couldn't shake the sense that Mrs. Wilson's welcome was more of an obligation than a kindness. "Thank you for receiving me," Florence replied, trying her best to meet the woman's gaze. "I look forward to meeting Lady Isabel and settling into my new role." Mrs. Wilson's lips tightened into a thin line, though there was no mistaking the way she examined Florence, as if sizing her up. "His Grace is away at present on business. You will meet him upon his return in a week. In the meantime, you shall become acquainted with the child and your duties here." Florence followed Mrs. Wilson inside, noting the absence of warmth in the vast entrance hall. The high ceilings seemed to echo with emptiness, and though the room was furnished with rich antiques and ancestral portraits, it felt more like a museum than a home. The silence that hung in the air was oppressive, thick with unspoken history and unacknowledged grief. "The child takes her meals in the nursery," Mrs. Wilson continued, leading Florence up the grand staircase. "You will join her there. His Grace dines alone when in residence. And Miss Frances," she paused, her voice dropping slightly, "I must warn you, the previous governesses, none of them lasted long. The child has been difficult, and His Grace's emotional withdrawal has not helped." Florence's heart tightened at the implication, but she held her chin high. "I am not easily discouraged," she said softly, though her words felt fragile in the face of Mrs. Wilson's skepticism. She couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the previous governesses and what kind of child Lady Isabel truly was. As they reached the top of the stairs, Mrs. Wilson stopped in front of a door and turned to face Florence. "This will be your room," she said curtly, gesturing to a modest chamber with a small fireplace and a narrow bed. Florence stepped inside, taking in the simplicity of the space, a far cry from the grand chambers of the aristocracy she had imagined. Still, it was a comfortable room, with a view of the untended rose garden below. After freshening up, Florence steeled herself for her first meeting with Lady Isabel. She had been hired to teach the child, yes, but more than that, she felt an undeniable pull to help heal what seemed to be a broken family. She had read the letter of employment carefully. There was more than just an educational role expected of her. She was here to help mend the hearts of both father and daughter, though she wondered if she was truly equipped for such a task. She made her way down the corridor to the nursery, where Mrs. Wilson had told her the child would be. The door was slightly ajar, and as Florence approached, she could hear the sound of raised voices, one adult voice attempting to restore order while a child cried in frustration. Florence paused for a moment before gently knocking. The scene that greeted her upon entering was one of chaos. Books and toys were scattered across the floor, and a young boy of about 8 was engaged in what appeared to be an impromptu fencing match with a fireplace poker, while his twin cheered him on. An older boy sat quietly in a corner, reading a book, seemingly indifferent to the chaos around him. In the corner, a little girl with honey-colored curls was cutting paper dolls with intense concentration, her small face scrunched in focus. The noise in the room came to an abrupt halt as all 4 children turned to assess Florence. Their gazes were critical, almost measuring, as if they were determining whether or not she was worthy of their time. "Good afternoon," Florence said softly but with quiet authority. "I am Miss Florence Francis, and I have the privilege of being your new governess." The eldest boy, a serious-looking child with dark brown hair and piercing blue eyes, stood slowly and approached her. He regarded her with a sharp gaze, his posture as stiff as the housekeeper's. "How long do you intend to stay, Miss Francis?" he asked bluntly. "The last governess, Miss Edwards, lasted only 2 months. She was unfit." She was. Florence met his challenging gaze, her heart pounding. "I intend to stay as long as I am needed, Master Clement," she said with a steady voice. "I am here to help you, and I believe we can learn from each other." The boy's expression softened, but only slightly. "Very well, Miss Francis. You may try." He stepped aside, allowing the other children to assess her in turn. Florence smiled warmly, feeling the first small breakthrough. "Shall we begin our lessons?" she asked gently. At that moment, the door to the nursery swung open, and a small figure stepped forward. It was Lady Isabel, the child whom Florence had come to teach. Her face, though pale, was strikingly beautiful. She resembled her mother in every way. But there was something haunting in her large, sorrowful eyes, and Florence could feel the weight of the grief she carried. Isabel's lips were pressed tightly together as she looked at Florence with an expression that seemed to say, "Prove yourself worthy." Florence's heart ached as she stepped toward the child. She had been hired to teach, yes, but more than that. She was here to help the little girl find joy again. She bent down to Isabel's eye level, her voice soft. "Good afternoon, Lady Isabel," she said with a smile. "Shall we have our first lesson together?" For the first time in 2 years, A flicker of curiosity crossed the young girl's face, and Florence knew that this was the beginning of something far deeper than mere instruction. Florence stood still for a moment after her introduction, her gaze lingering on Lady Isabel. The young girl was seated by the window, a faded book open in her lap, but her attention was far from the pages. The light from the afternoon sun bathed her in a soft glow, but it couldn't quite erase the shadows beneath her eyes. Isabel's delicate features were framed by a mass of golden curls, yet there was something in her expression, something distant, that made Florence's heart ache. Florence took a slow step forward, careful not to disturb the fragile silence that hung between them. The moment she crossed the threshold of the nursery, the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift, as though the air itself was charged with some heavy, unspoken sorrow. The children, all of whom had been watching her with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion, turned their attention to their younger sister. Isabel, however, made no move to greet her, her lips pressed tight as she avoided Florence's gaze. Florence knelt in front of Isabel, positioning herself at the child's eye level. "Good afternoon, Lady Isabel," she said gently, her voice soft and warm. Isabel's eyes flickered, the faintest sign of acknowledgement, before she quickly lowered her gaze to the book in her hands. Florence smiled kindly, understanding that it would take more than just a few words to reach this little girl. She glanced up at the other children, who had been watching her closely. The eldest, a boy with serious brown eyes and the bearing of someone far older than his years, stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Miss Francis, I trust you will be effective with her," he said, his tone formal yet laden with a hint of skepticism. His gaze was sharp, as if he were already judging her, testing whether she could live up to the challenge. Florence smiled softly and nodded. "I intend to do my best, Master Clement," she replied, her voice filled with resolve. "Every child learns differently. I will take the time to understand Lady Isabel's needs and find the right way to connect with her." At her words, Clement, the younger twin, who had been holding an impromptu fencing match with a fireplace poker, paused and eyed Florence with interest. Frederick, the second twin, looked up from a pile of books with a mischievous glint in his eye but said nothing. The room settled into a quiet tension as the children observed their new governess. Florence's focus returned to Isabel. Gently, she reached for the book in the girl's hands, her fingers brushing the soft cover. "May I?" she asked, her tone so soft it was nearly a whisper. Isabel didn't answer, but she allowed Florence to take the book. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, and the pages seemed to have been thumbed through countless times. Florence opened it carefully and read aloud, "The Adventures of Robin Hood," her voice lilting as she began the first line. Isabel's gaze flickered briefly to the words on the page, but there was no smile, no expression of recognition. Florence paused, waiting for a response. When none came, she closed the book gently and placed it on the small table beside them. "Perhaps we could find something new for you to read, Lady Isabel," she suggested. "Something that might capture your interest." Isabel looked up for the first time since Florence had entered the room. Her eyes were large and full of quiet sadness, and for a brief moment, Florence thought she caught a glimmer of something else, something like a plea. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same guarded, distant expression. Florence's heart tightened with empathy. She had seen this before. The coldness in the child's eyes was a reflection of something deeper, something that had been broken. But how could she fix it? How could she reach a heart so closed off from the world? Before she could ask another question, the door to the nursery opened with a soft creak, and a tall figure stepped inside. Florence's gaze shifted to the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. Duke Clement Alfred stood in the threshold, his posture rigid and formal. He was a striking figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark, tailored suit that contrasted with the warmth of the room. His dark brown hair was neatly combed, and his face, though handsome, was set in a cold, impenetrable expression. The room grew even quieter at his entrance, and for a moment, Florence wondered if she had somehow misstepped. But the Duke's presence felt like a wall unreachable and unyielding. He turned his gaze to Isabel, who was still sitting with her book, her back straight but her expression unreadable. "Lady Isabel," the Duke said, his voice deep but distant, as though he were addressing a stranger. "I trust you are behaving yourself?" Isabel didn't respond. She didn't even look up at him. Florence felt the chill in the room deepen. It was clear that there was no warmth in their relationship. The Duke's words were not spoken with affection or tenderness, but with a formality that felt distant and almost mechanical. Florence noticed how Isabel flinched ever so slightly at the sound of her father's voice, as though she had become accustomed to his coldness. The silence stretched between father and daughter, and Florence realized that this was the dynamic of their household, a deep well of sorrow and emotional withdrawal that neither of them had learned how to navigate. The Duke's gaze shifted to Florence, his eyes narrowing slightly, though not in hostility, rather in quiet evaluation. "Miss Francis," he said with a measured tone, "I trust you will be able to handle her." Florence met his gaze with a calm resolve. "I will do my best, Your Grace," she said. "I believe that every child can be reached, if one is willing to understand them." Clement's eyes flickered for the briefest of moments, as though he was searching for something in her words, something that might give him hope. But then, as quickly as the moment had come, it passed. He gave a small, curt nod and turned to leave, his footsteps heavy as he retreated down the hall. The coldness in his departure was palpable. Florence turned back to Isabel, who had not moved since the Duke's departure. She sat frozen in her chair, her expression as distant as her father's. Florence's heart ached for the child. How could she break through this wall of sorrow and silence that surrounded her? Slowly, Florence rose and moved to Isabel's side. She gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, offering the comfort that seemed so desperately needed. "Lady Isabel," she said softly, "I know your heart is heavy, but I want you to know that I am here for you. We will work together, and I promise that we will find a way to heal the hurt you are carrying." Isabel's gaze flickered briefly toward Florence, but she said nothing. Instead, she lowered her head once more, staring at the book in her lap, her fingers curling tightly around its edges. Florence could see the deep sorrow in her eyes, a sorrow that went far beyond grief. It was the kind of sorrow that came from years of being unseen, of being overlooked, of feeling abandoned by the very people who should have been there to offer love and support. Florence let out a slow breath, realizing that the task ahead of her would not be easy. Isabel's emotional withdrawal was not something that could be fixed overnight. It would take patience, kindness, and above all, time. But Florence was determined to help her. She could see the little girl's potential buried beneath the grief, and she would do whatever it took to bring it to the surface. But as she looked down at Isabel, Florence couldn't help but wonder, could she reach the child without also reaching the man who had locked away his own heart? Duke Clement Alfred was not a man accustomed to showing vulnerability, to revealing the pain that he had carried for so long. His distance from Isabel was not just a product of his grief, it was a self-imposed exile from the emotions he had never allowed himself to process. Florence understood that grief in a way few others could. She had lost much in her life, her parents, her former life as a teacher, and now, it seemed, she had been hired to care for a family that was fractured beyond repair. Yet she saw a spark of something in the Duke's eyes, something she hadn't seen in Isabel's, a man who had not yet given up on the possibility of healing. As she sat beside Isabel, Florence realized that her task was not just to heal a grieving child, it was to heal a family one heart at a time. But she knew this journey would not be easy, and as much as she hoped to be the one to heal them, she also wondered if she was ready to face the deep wounds of the Duke's heart that seemed so out of reach. The challenge was greater than she had anticipated, but in that moment, Florence made a vow to herself. She would not leave Ashford Hall until she had helped mend what was broken not just for Isabel, but for the Duke as well. As she sat with the child, Florence realized that her own heart had already begun to become entwined with theirs. In this house of sorrow, she was determined to bring light if only they would let her. Florence sat at the small desk in her chamber, the quiet stillness of Ashford Hall weighing heavily upon her. The low fire crackled in the grate, its flickering light casting soft shadows across the room. Her gaze drifted to the small trunk at the foot of her bed, the one that contained all the remnants of her past life. Her fingers hovered over the delicate lacework on the handkerchief. Her mother had given her the last gift her mother had ever given her before the cruel hand of fate took her away. A pang of longing hit Florence's chest as she folded the linen carefully, remembering the woman who had raised her alone, with no help from anyone. Her mother, Eleanor Francis, had been beautiful, with a soft smile and a quiet strength that Florence had always admired. But Eleanor had been a woman of limited means, and Florence's birth had been a scandal. The Earl of Thornbury, a man of high rank and wealth, had seduced her mother under the guise of love, only to abandon them both when Florence was born. The shame that came with being the illegitimate daughter of a nobleman was a constant weight that Florence had carried with her all her life. She remembered the whispers of the town's people, the cold stares of those who would never look at her the same way they did their legitimate children. Florence had known from a young age that her future would not be the same as theirs. But her mother had given her a sense of dignity, teaching her to rise above the judgments of others, to carry herself with quiet grace, even when her heart was broken. When her mother had passed from an illness just after Florence's 16th birthday, Florence had found herself alone in the world. They had never been wealthy, and the money her mother had saved was meager at best. But Florence's determination had not faltered. She sought work, taking on the roles that others would not, and gradually saved enough money to attend a local school for girls. There, she had learned to read, write, and teach, but the road had been long and fraught with hardship. After her mother's death, Florence had taken her mother's maiden name of Francis, hoping to escape the shadow of Thornbury. She had no intention of ever acknowledging the Earl again. In her heart, she had no desire to carry the name of a man who had discarded them both so easily. But fate had a way of shaping her life in unexpected ways. Florence's reverie was interrupted by a light knock at the door. She quickly wiped her eyes, as if the weight of her past could be erased with a swift motion. "Come in," she called, taking a deep breath to compose herself. The door opened, and Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper, stepped inside with a tray of tea. The older woman's sharp eyes assessed Florence as she set the tray down on the small table by the window. "Tea, Miss Francis," Mrs. Wilson said, her voice clipped. "I trust you are settling in well." Florence offered a polite smile, though she could tell that Mrs. Wilson was still uncertain of her. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. The room is comfortable." The housekeeper gave a short nod, but there was something in her expression that made Florence wary. "I thought you should know," Mrs. Wilson continued, her voice lowering. "His Grace has been impressed by your influence on Lady Isabel." Florence blinked in surprise. I've only just begun to teach her." "Nevertheless," Mrs. Wilson said with a slight smile, "it seems the child responds well to you. There's no denying that she's not the easiest of children to care for, and her father, well, he has his own burdens. But it's evident you've already started to make a difference." Florence felt a rush of warmth at the praise, though she tried to hide it. "I am simply doing my best to care for her. It is no easy task, given her grief." "Indeed," Mrs. Wilson said, her tone softening just slightly. "But His Grace has been watching you, Miss Francis. I've seen it in the way he looks at you when you interact with Lady Isabel. He doesn't show it often, but he's noticing." Florence's heart gave a sharp jolt at the mention of the Duke. She had not thought much about the Duke's reaction to her presence in the household, other than the fact that he was distant and formal. Clement Alfred, the Duke, had seemed like a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, a man whose grief and sorrow were buried too deep to be reached. She had seen the way his eyes softened when he watched her with Isabel, but it was always brief, gone in the blink of an eye, like something he could never allow himself to feel. "I'm not sure I understand," Florence said quietly, her hands smoothing the delicate lace of her dress as she tried to mask her discomfort. "His Grace has been kind, but I have seen little indication of anything beyond formality." Mrs. Wilson's expression was unreadable. "He is a man of great restraint, Miss Francis. But his eyes, they are not as cold as they seem. Just wait and see." Florence nodded but said nothing more. She had seen enough of the Duke to know that there was a deep, unspoken sorrow behind his eyes. But could anyone reach him? She had come to teach Isabel, yes, but she had also come to heal. The child's grief mirrored her own in many ways, and the Duke's distance mirrored the way Florence had felt in her own life, alone, abandoned, and struggling to cope. The next day, Florence found herself walking along the long corridor of Ashford Hall, the weight of the Duke's words from the night before echoing in her mind. He had been distant, yes, but something had shifted when they spoke about Isabel. She had noticed the way his eyes lingered on her, almost as if he was searching for something in her. She felt the weight of that gaze. Yet it was not uncomfortable, it was almost as if he, too, was searching for answers. She had expected him to remain aloof, to continue to keep his distance. After all, it was clear that his grief had created an impenetrable wall around him, one that would take more than a governess to breach. But as she passed the study that day, she caught sight of the Duke standing by the window, his back to her. His figure was broad and imposing, his posture straight and regal. Florence hesitated for a moment before gathering her courage. "Your Grace?" she called softly. He turned, and she was caught off guard by the intensity in his gaze. It was the first time he had truly looked at her since her arrival, and she could see the weight of his emotions behind those deep-set eyes. "Miss Francis," he said, his voice soft but firm, "I trust Lady Isabel is doing well." Florence nodded, feeling an unexpected warmth at the mention of the child. "Yes, Your Grace. We've made some progress. She's still reserved, but I believe she's beginning to open up." "I've noticed," the Duke said, his lips pressing together as he stared at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. There was something in the way he looked at her that made Florence's heart flutter unexpectedly. She had never seen him this vulnerable, never seen him let down his guard, even for a moment. "I must admit," he said after a moment, "I did not expect to find someone so capable in such a short time." Florence's breath caught in her throat. "I am only doing what I can, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Lady Isabel's well-being is my utmost concern." He studied her for a long moment, and Florence could feel the invisible tension between them. "I can see that," he murmured, almost to himself. "I can see that in everything you do." The silence stretched on, and Florence, despite herself, felt the stirrings of an emotion she had not expected. She had come here to teach, to heal the broken hearts of father and daughter. But in that moment, she wondered if it was not just Isabel who needed healing. The Duke, too, was a man lost in his own grief, and perhaps, she thought, her role here was not only to mend Isabel's broken heart, but to touch the heart of the man who had closed his off from the world. But Florence quickly shook off the thought. The boundaries between them were clear. He was her employer, a man of noble blood, and she was simply a governess, a woman of humble origins. There was no room for such emotions to flourish, no matter how much she might feel the pull of something more. That evening, as Florence sat by the fire in her chamber, a letter arrived. It was from Mr. Edgar Whitmore, the wealthy textile merchant who had once proposed marriage to her. Florence's stomach twisted as she recognized the handwriting. She had not heard from him in over 2 years, not since she had rejected his proposal. She opened the letter with trembling hands, her breath catching as she read the words that followed. Whitmore's letter was filled with scorn, accusing her of being a woman of loose morals, suggesting that she had been his mistress before he had proposed to her. He claimed that Florence had only accepted the position at Ashford Hall as a way to escape her past, a past that, he said, would soon catch up with her. The bile rose in her throat as she read the letter, the accusations cutting deeper than she could have imagined. Florence knew Whitmore had never truly loved her. He had been cruel and controlling, and when she had rejected him, he had resorted to spiteful lies. But now, he was trying to ruin her new life. He had somehow discovered her position at Ashford Hall and was intent on destroying her reputation. As Florence set the letter aside, she knew the storm that was coming. Whitmore had already made a name for himself as a man of influence in society. His lies, if spread, could ruin her chance at ever being accepted anywhere again. The next day, Florence's worst fears were realized. Lady Constance Pemberton, Clement's former fiancée, made her first appearance at Ashford Hall. Florence had heard whispers of her from the house staff, how Constance had been waiting for Clement to propose to her since his wife's death. The moment Constance entered the room, Florence could sense the animosity between them. Constance, tall and elegant, held herself with an air of superiority, her eyes sweeping over Florence with cool appraisal. She had a plan, Florence could tell, and it didn't involve Florence's continued presence at Ashford Hall. "Miss Francis," Lady Constance said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "how lovely to finally meet the woman who has taken up residence here." Florence's pulse quickened as she held the other woman's gaze. "It is a pleasure, Lady Constance," she replied politely, though the words felt stiff on her tongue. Lady Constance's smile widened just slightly, but the glint in her eyes suggested a challenge was coming. Florence had no illusions about the true nature of the woman before her. She had been watching and waiting for the opportunity to strike, and Florence knew it was only a matter of time before her past and Whitmore's lies would be used against her. Little did she know, Lady Constance was already plotting her downfall. Lady Constance Pemberton sat at her vanity, the faint light of the candle casting flickering shadows on her face. Her lips curled into a tight smile as she surveyed her reflection in the mirror. Tonight would be the night, she thought with a certain satisfaction. Tonight, the Duke would finally see how dangerous a mistake he had made by hiring Florence Francis. The governess may have won the affection of his daughter, but Florence was no match for the cunning and reputation of Lady Constance. With a soft sigh, Constance rose from the vanity and walked to the window, her hands resting lightly on the delicate lace curtains. She looked out at the sprawling grounds of Ashford Hall, watching as the evening shadows lengthened across the gardens. The Duke's manor was more than a home to her, it was her rightful place. She had waited patiently for Clement to come to his senses, to realize that she was the woman he needed by his side. His late wife's memory had faded enough by now, yet, despite her intentions and her steadfast patience, another woman had come into their lives, a woman whose past was far from spotless. Florence Francis, the naive governess who had charmed the Duke and his daughter, was standing in the way of her future. Florence had dared to take the place that Lady Constance believed was hers by right, and now, with Mr. Edgar Whitmore's letter of accusation in her hands, Constance knew it was time to destroy Florence's reputation, once and for all. She had been patient, but patience had its limits. Lady Constance had no intention of confronting Florence directly. No, that would be far too obvious. Instead, she had enlisted the help of a more subtle instrument. Mr. Sinclair, a private investigator with the connections and the discretion necessary to dig into Florence's past. Constance knew how to play the game of high society, where a whisper could ruin a woman's life, and she had no qualms about using whatever tools were necessary to ensure her victory. She had first hired Mr. Sinclair weeks ago, before Florence had even arrived at Ashford Hall. The investigator was thorough, leaving no stone unturned as he traced Florence's lineage back to her mother, Eleanor Francis. It hadn't taken long for Sinclair to uncover the truth. Florence was the illegitimate daughter of the Earl of Thornbury. Her mother, an impoverished woman, had been abandoned by the Earl when Florence was just a child. Constance's lips tightened as she read through the report. Florence's connection to the noble family was not only illegitimate, but shameful. And then, there were the rumors of Florence's past with Whitmore, the wealthy merchant who had once proposed to her. The investigator had dug up whispers of their relationship, a failed courtship that ended in bitterness. Whitmore, furious at being rejected, had spread damaging rumors about Florence. His accusations of loose morals were well known, and Constance knew that if she timed it correctly, these revelations could ruin Florence in one fell swoop. With a sense of malicious satisfaction, Constance made her plans. At tonight's dinner party, she would reveal Florence's past to the entire household. The Duke would be forced to confront the scandal that was growing around his new governess. Florence's position would be shattered, and Constance would finally take the place that was rightfully hers. The grand dining room of Ashford Hall was filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the clinking of fine china as the dinner party progressed. The guests, many of whom were influential members of society, seemed unaware of the storm that was about to break over them. Lady Constance, seated at the Duke's right hand, played her part perfectly, speaking with the utmost civility while her mind churned with anticipation. Florence, dressed in a simple yet elegant gown of soft lavender, stood at the far end of the room, serving the guests with the quiet grace that had won her the affection of Lady Isabel, and it seemed the Duke as well. Her presence, though humble, seemed to fill the room with a quiet dignity, but it wasn't enough, not for Constance. As the meal continued, Constance exchanged a look with Mr. Sinclair, who had been standing near the door for the better part of the evening. He nodded ever so slightly, signaling that the moment had come. Constance rose gracefully from her seat, a cold smile playing on her lips. The entire room seemed to fall silent as she addressed the gathering. "Forgive me for interrupting," she said with a tone that was sweet, but edged with something darker. "But there is something of great concern that I believe you all should know." Florence's heart skipped a beat as she glanced nervously toward the head of the table. The Duke, who had been speaking to a nearby guest, suddenly stilled. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the guests looking at Constance with curiosity. "I have recently been informed of certain details about Miss Francis's past," Constance continued, her voice smooth and controlled. She made no effort to glance at Florence, but instead focused all of her attention on the Duke. "It seems that Miss Francis's family history is not as respectable as it might appear. It has come to light that she is, in fact, the illegitimate daughter of the Earl of Thornbury." There was a sudden collective gasp from the guests. Florence's blood ran cold, and she fought to keep her composure as the whispers started. Constance's eyes shone with triumph as she continued. "But that is not all," she added, her voice almost a whisper, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "It seems Miss Francis also has a rather unsavory reputation, one that has followed her throughout her life. She was once pursued by Mr. Edgar Whitmore, a wealthy merchant, who proposed marriage to her. But when she refused, Mr. Whitmore claims that she was his mistress, a woman of loose morals." A murmur rippled through the room, and Florence felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. She had never imagined that her past would come back to haunt her so quickly. The accusations were lies that Whitmore had spread to get back at her for rejecting him. But in this moment, Constance's words had the power to ruin everything she had worked for. The Duke's face had gone pale, and he looked between Florence and Constance, his expression one of disbelief and confusion. Florence could see the doubt in his eyes, and for a moment she feared that he might believe the lies that were being spread about her. But before she could say anything, the room grew silent as the Duke stood up, his chair scraping across the marble floor. "Enough," Clement said, his voice firm but strained. "This is not the time nor the place for such gossip." But Constance wasn't finished. She had already planted the seed of doubt, and she would not let it go without fully making her case. "But, Your Grace, the truth cannot be ignored. Miss Francis's past—" "I said enough, Constance," the Duke interrupted, his voice colder now. He turned to Florence, his gaze searching her face. "Is this true, Miss Francis?" Florence felt a lump form in her throat, but she forced herself to meet the Duke's gaze. "No, Your Grace," she said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "It is not true. The rumors that Mr. Whitmore has spread are false. I had no relations with him. He is simply angry that I rejected him." The Duke's eyes softened for a brief moment, but he quickly masked the emotion. He turned away from her and walked to the window, staring out into the night. Florence could feel the weight of his silence, the burden of his judgment pressing down on her. Later that night, after the guests had left, the Duke called Florence into his study. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room, but the Duke's demeanor was anything but warm. He stood by the window, his back to her, his posture rigid. "Miss Francis," he began, his voice strained, "I need to know the truth. Is what Constance said true? Are you really the daughter of the Earl of Thornbury?" Florence swallowed the lump in her throat, feeling the weight of his scrutiny. "It's true that I am the daughter of Earl Thornbury," she said quietly, "but I am not ashamed of that. I've worked hard to make my own way, to build a life separate from him. And as for Mr. Whitmore, I have already told you he lies. I never had an affair with him. He is simply angry that I rejected him." The Duke's silence stretched between them, the weight of his internal conflict clear. He had heard the rumors, and now he was unsure what to believe. The elegant facade of Ashford Hall seemed to crumble as the air grew heavier with the unspoken tension. "You must understand," the Duke said, his voice quiet but strained. "This is not simply a matter of your reputation. It's about my daughter, my family. I cannot afford to have such a scandal surrounding us." Florence's heart sank. "Your Grace, I would never do anything to harm you or your family. I only want to help Isabel, to see her smile again." The Duke turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is about Isabel?" he asked, his voice rising. "I hired you to teach her, yes. But this," he gestured toward the door, toward the scandal that had been brought into their lives. "This is about far more than just Isabel." Florence stood her ground, though every word felt like a dagger. "I understand the weight of your concerns, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. "But I will not leave. I have given my word to your daughter, and I will not break it, no matter what rumors are spread about me." The Duke's words lingered in the air, a heavy silence descending between them. Florence knew that she had no choice but to leave. The Duke had made his decision, and she had no place here in the face of the scandal that had been brought to light. But as she prepared to leave the next morning, her heart ached. She had come to care for Lady Isabel, to believe that, perhaps, she could make a difference in the broken family. Yet the very person who had seemed so close, so reachable, was now distant, cold, just like everyone else in her life. In the quiet of her room, as she packed her meager belongings, she wondered if she had ever truly belonged anywhere. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden light through the heavy curtains of the Duke's study when the news arrived. Florence, still in her simple morning gown, was reading in the nursery when Mrs. Pembroke hurried into the room, her face pale and tight with concern. "Miss Frances," she gasped, catching her breath. "Lady Isabel, she's very ill." Florence's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a little more frantic than she intended. "Fever, miss," Mrs. Pembroke explained, wringing her hands. "The poor child has been burning with it since the night before, and now she can barely breathe. The doctor has been called." Florence's chest tightened with an unexplainable fear. Isabel, though quiet and reserved, had been a fragile flower in many ways, and this fever seemed to have come on too suddenly, too violently. "Where is she now?" "The nursery. I've tried to comfort her, but—" Mrs. Pembroke's voice trailed off in a way that suggested she knew there was little that could be done. Florence wasted no time. She quickly turned, making her way toward the nursery with quick but steady steps, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seen the child's illness progress in a way that was too familiar, too terrifying. Florence had lost her mother to an illness when she was young, and the memory of helplessly watching someone she loved slip away was still a fresh wound in her heart. The nursery door was ajar, and Florence slipped inside without a sound. Lady Isabel lay in her bed, her small frame twisted and flushed with fever. Her once vibrant curls were matted to her forehead with sweat, and her breathing came in shallow, painful gasps. Mrs. Pembroke hovered at the foot of the bed, wringing her hands in distress. The nursemaid's usual plump figure was gone, replaced by an uncharacteristic thinness as worry etched her face. Isabel's pale cheeks were damp with perspiration, and her lips were barely parted as she whispered something incoherent under her breath. Florence's heart clenched at the sight. Without a second thought, she moved to Isabel's side. Kneeling beside the child's bed, Florence reached out to smooth the hair from Isabel's forehead, her touch gentle and soothing. "Isabel," she whispered softly, her voice trembling slightly with fear. "It's me, Florence. You're going to be all right. Endeavory." Isabel's feverish eyes fluttered open, just for a moment, and their gaze met. A flicker of recognition passed between them, but Isabel could not speak. She only gave a weak, pitiful moan in response. Florence rose quickly, her heart racing. "I'll fetch the doctor," she said to Mrs. Pembroke, but the nursemaid shook her head. "I already sent for him, miss," Mrs. Pembroke replied. "But it's bad, worse than I've ever seen. The doctor said if the fever doesn't break soon, it could be diphtheria. He's afraid for her." The word hit Florence like a physical blow. Diphtheria was a cruel disease, and its toll on children was often unforgiving. The fear in Mrs. Pembroke's voice was something Florence knew all too well, and the panic began to surge through her own veins. "I won't leave her," Florence said suddenly, her resolve hardening. She turned to the nursemaid, who was staring at her in wide-eyed astonishment. "I'll stay by her side. I don't care about the risk. I'll care for her myself." Mrs. Pembroke hesitated, her lips trembling as she seemed to debate something. "But miss, the doctor said it's contagious. You can't." "I don't care," Florence interrupted firmly, her voice soft yet filled with the quiet determination of a woman who had long learned how to fight for those she loved. "She needs someone. I won't leave her alone." The next few days became a blur of fevered sweat and long, restless nights. Florence stayed at Isabel's side, administering medicine when the doctor arrived, and doing everything she could to comfort the child. The fever never seemed to break, rising and falling in violent waves, and Isabel grew weaker with each passing hour. Florence refused to leave her post beside the child's bed, even when Mrs. Pembroke begged her to rest. She wiped Isabel's brow with cool cloths, tried to coax her into drinking water, and kept her calm when the child's breath grew ragged. Florence's hands, usually soft and delicate from years of teaching, were now rough from constant tending to Isabel, but she didn't mind. She would sacrifice whatever it took. Isabel was too young, too precious to lose. Clement watched from the doorway the first night Florence stayed by Isabel's side. He had paced in his study for hours, unsure of what to do, feeling powerless in the face of his daughter's suffering. The doctor had given his prognosis grim but not entirely hopeless, but Clement found it hard to focus on the words. He only knew one thing. Isabel was slipping away from him, and he couldn't bear the thought. He had heard the soft murmur of Florence's voice as she comforted Isabel, but he hadn't stepped inside. His heart wrenched at the sight of her there, by his daughter's side, her brow furrowed in concentration and worry as she held Isabel's fragile form. Florence's selflessness stunned him. In that moment, he realized just how deeply she had embedded herself into their lives, not just as a governess, but as someone who truly cared, someone who could bring warmth and light into the cold, sorrowful house he had built. He had never thought he could let anyone in again after his wife's death. But Florence, with her gentle nature and unwavering devotion, had shattered the walls he had built around his heart. The second night was the hardest. Clement sat in his study, but he couldn't focus. He rose and walked toward the nursery, his steps silent on the marble floors. He couldn't help but feel the pull to check on them, to see for himself how Isabel was faring and if Florence was holding up. He had noticed her growing weariness, her tired eyes, her fragile frame, and the way she seemed to push herself beyond what was reasonable. But she had insisted on staying, and he couldn't bring himself to make her leave. Her presence had a calming effect on Isabel, and in turn, it was soothing something inside Clement, a something he hadn't realized was broken until it started to heal. As he approached the nursery, he paused outside the door. He heard Florence's voice, soft and comforting, murmuring to Isabel. He opened the door quietly, careful not to disturb them. Inside, Florence was sitting by the bedside, her hand resting on Isabel's forehead. Isabel's breathing had become more labored, and the sound broke Clement's heart. "Florence," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the weight of the night. She looked up, startled, her face pale and tired, but her eyes filled with a quiet resolve that struck him to his core. "Your Grace," she said, standing quickly. She swayed slightly but steadied herself. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to disturb you." "You haven't disturbed me," Clement replied, stepping forward. He reached for her elbow, supporting her as she stumbled slightly. "You need rest. You've been awake for too long." "I can't leave her," Florence murmured, her voice strained. "Not while she needs me." Clement stared at her, his chest tightening with both admiration and an ache he couldn't quite place. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, something long buried under grief and time. He had been so closed off, so afraid to let anyone in, but Florence was making him rethink everything. He crouched beside her, his gaze softening. "You're a remarkable woman, Florence. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." Florence shook her head, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. "You don't need to thank me, Your Grace. This is what I'm here for." But Clement couldn't shake the growing realization that he didn't just owe her gratitude. He owed her something far more, something he hadn't realized he had been missing until now. As he watched her, her hair now loose and tangled from sleepless nights, her face drawn with exhaustion but glowing with quiet strength, he realized that his heart had been quietly opening to her, whether he wanted it to or not. The third day brought with it the moment that Clement had feared but also hoped for. Isabel's fever began to break. Florence had not left her side, even when the doctor's visits grew more and more infrequent, and his grim assurances were not enough to ease the Duke's mind. Florence had stayed, offering her steady, soothing presence, and now, as Isabel's temperature began to cool and her breathing grew steadier, Clement felt the rush of relief flood through him. But as he entered the nursery and saw Florence slumped in a chair, her head resting against the side of the bed, he realized how much of a toll it had taken on her. Her eyes were closed, and her face was pale and drained of energy. She had collapsed from exhaustion, unable to keep going any longer. Without thinking, Clement walked toward her, gently lifting her into his arms. She stirred in his hold, her eyes fluttering open. "Florence," he murmured, his voice softer than he intended, "you've done enough." She looked up at him, her face streaked with tear stains. "Isabel, she's going to be all right, isn't she?" she asked, her voice weak, but filled with the smallest trace of hope. "She's going to be fine," Clement replied, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had never known how much he had come to depend on Florence until now. She had saved his daughter, and in doing so, she had begun to heal something within him that he hadn't even known needed healing. He carried her to a guest room, laying her gently on the bed. As she drifted off into a much-needed sleep, Clement stood by her side for a long time, watching over her with a mixture of awe and something deeper, something he had not allowed himself to feel for years. For the first time in a long time, Clement allowed himself to feel the weight of his emotions. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart were beginning to crumble, and it was Florence, this quiet, unassuming woman, who had done what no one else had managed. she had made him feel again. And he knew, in that moment, that nothing would ever be the same again. The soft crackle of the fire was the only sound in the room as Florence's eyes fluttered open. The heavy curtains were drawn back slightly, allowing the early morning light to filter into the room in gentle golden streams. She squinted against the brightness, her head aching from days of exhaustion, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. But then it all came rushing back, the fevered nights spent by Isabel's side, the constant worry, the long hours without rest. Florence had not slept more than a few hours at a time for days, but she had never once considered leaving Isabel alone. When she finally turned her head, the sight that greeted her took her breath away. Duke Clement Alfred was sitting beside her, on a chair near her bed, his head bowed in quiet contemplation. His strong hands were resting on his knees, but it was the look on his face that caught Florence's attention. It was the look of a man torn between his duty, his grief, and the unspoken emotions that had begun to surface in the days since Isabel's illness. Florence blinked slowly, her voice weak but still steady. "Your Grace." Clement's gaze snapped to hers, his deep-set eyes filled with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Florence," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. He reached for her hand, his touch warm and firm as he cupped it in his own. "You've done something for me that no one else could have. You saved Isabel's life, and in doing so, you've healed something in me I thought was beyond saving." Florence's breath caught, but she said nothing. His words, his sincere gratitude made her heart swell, but they also stirred something else within her. She had known Clement only as the distant duke, a man burdened by sorrow, incapable of moving past the death of his wife. But now, as she lay before him, weary but alive, Florence saw a side of him she had never imagined. A man who was finally beginning to let go of his grief, a man willing to confront the possibility of loving again. For a long moment, neither spoke. The quiet stretched between them, and Florence felt as though she had entered a delicate space between dreams and reality. She could still feel the weight of her exhaustion pressing on her eyelids, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the Duke. Finally, Clement broke the silence. "I thought I could never love again, Florence," he said quietly, his voice unsteady. "After Caroline's death, I built a wall around my heart, convinced that I would never feel anything for anyone again. I thought I had lost the capacity to love." Florence's throat tightened, and she could feel the pain in his words. She had known grief in her life, though it had been a quieter kind of sorrow. But she could understand how a loss like his could feel like a death of its own. "I was wrong," Clement continued, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that seemed to reach into her very soul. "I was waiting for you, Florence. You came into my life, and I realized that love is not something you can simply shut away. You've brought something back into my world that I thought was gone forever: hope. You've given Isabel that hope, and you've given me a chance to be the man I once was. I don't know how to thank you for that." "I see that either even." Florence felt a lump rise in her throat, but her voice came out soft and uncertain. "I never expected," she trailed off, her words faltering in the face of the depth of his confession. What could she say to that? How could she possibly respond to such raw honesty, especially when her heart was already tangled with her own feelings for him? Clement moved closer to the bed, his hand still holding hers. "Florence," he said, his voice now low, the weight of his decision clear in his eyes. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I don't just want you to be the governess to my daughter. I want you to be a part of this family. I want you to be the woman I share my life with." His words echoed through her, a slow, steady thrum of emotion that seemed to fill the room. Her breath hitched in her throat as she realized what he was asking. He wasn't just offering her a life as a companion. He was offering her something deeper, a life together, as partners in every sense of the word. Florence began, her voice shaky as the magnitude of his proposal hit her. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Clement replied, his voice a quiet murmur. "I know what I'm asking, and I know the risks. Society will never accept it, but I don't care about that anymore. I care about you. I care about what you've brought to my life, to Isabel's life, and I want you to be a part of it forever." Florence felt her heart swell with a mixture of disbelief and joy. He was asking her to be his wife. She had come here to care for his daughter, to teach her and guide her through her grief, but now, unexpectedly, Clement had shown her that their connection went far beyond that of a governess and an employer. Before she could say anything, the door to the study creaked open, and Mrs. Wilson entered, her expression stiff but courteous. She took one look at the scene in front of her, the Duke kneeling at Florence's bedside, and her lips pressed into a thin line, though she said nothing. "Miss Frances, Your Grace," Mrs. Wilson said, her tone a bit more formal than usual. "Lady Constance has arrived. She's waiting in the drawing room." Clement straightened at once, releasing Florence's hand reluctantly, though his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary. "Of course," he said, his voice now distant and cold. He stood up, moving toward the door with purpose. "I'll attend to her. We'll speak more later, Florence." But before he could leave, Florence called out softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Clement," she said, and he turned back to her, his expression a mixture of confusion and hope. "Yes? I accept," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with a warmth that she could no longer contain. "I will marry you. I'll be the mother of your children." Clement's eyes widened with something akin to disbelief, and for a moment he stood frozen, as though he had not expected her to say yes. But then a radiant smile broke across his face, his features softening with a joy he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He stepped toward her once again, bending down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You've made me the happiest man in England, Florence." Later that evening, Clement stood before the grand mirror in the drawing room, his hands resting on the polished surface of the mantelpiece. Lady Constance sat on the other side of the room, her sharp eyes studying him, waiting for him to acknowledge her presence. "I assume you have something to say, Constance," Clement said coldly, not bothering to meet her gaze. He could feel the weight of the decision that had already been made, and he knew what was coming. "You've made your choice, I see," Lady Constance said, her voice tinged with a mixture of disdain and disbelief. "But you do realize what this means, don't you, Clement? The scandal will be unforgivable. She's not even of noble birth, and now you'll marry her. This will ruin everything you've worked for." Clement turned to face her now, his expression hardening. "You're right, Constance. It will ruin everything, but I don't care anymore." His voice was calm, but the finality in his words was unmistakable. "Florence is the woman I love, and I will marry her, regardless of what society thinks. You can do as you please, but I will not stand for anyone tarnishing her name. No one will speak ill of her in my house. And if they do, they will be barred from my company forever." Lady Constance's face blanched with fury, and she stood up abruptly, her elegant gown rustling as she moved to the door. "You'll regret this," she spat, her voice filled with venom. "Mark my words, Clement, you've made a terrible mistake." Before Clement could reply, the door slammed shut behind her, leaving him standing alone in the room, a sense of calm washing over him. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. The next morning, after the confrontation with Lady Constance, Clement found himself walking down the long corridor toward the nursery. He had promised Florence that he would be there for Isabel, that he would be the father she needed. He had realized, in his heart, that Isabel had been waiting for him to return to her, to let go of the past and embrace her as his daughter. When he entered the nursery, Isabel was sitting up in bed, a slight flush of color returning to her cheeks. Florence sat beside her, holding Isabel's hand and gently talking to her. As Clement approached, Isabel's eyes met his, and for the first time in 2 years, a smile appeared on her lips, a tentative but real smile. "Papa," Isabel whispered, her voice soft but clear. "You're here." Clement's heart swelled with emotion as he knelt beside her. "I'm here, Isabel," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Isabel reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Mama says you love me." Clement's gaze flickered toward Florence, who was watching them both with a soft smile. His heart filled with gratitude, and he knew, without a doubt, that this was the family he had been waiting for. Later that afternoon, Clement took Florence by the hand and led her to the garden. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the restored rose bushes and the freshly trimmed hedges. It was here, in the quiet of the garden, that Clement made his final declaration. "I will marry you, Florence," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "Not for duty, not for society, but because I love you. You've brought my family back together. You've healed Isabel, and you've healed me. I cannot imagine my life without you." Florence's eyes filled with tears as she gazed at him, overwhelmed by the depth of his words. "I love you too, Clement. I've always loved you." And in that moment, with the sun setting behind them, Clement knew that no matter the challenges they would face them together as a family. Weeks had passed since Clement and Florence had finally confessed their feelings to one another, and the transformation in Ashford Hall was undeniable. The once somber and oppressive atmosphere that had hung like a dark cloud over the house had gradually shifted, replaced by an air of warmth and tenderness. Florence's presence, gentle and steady, had brought a light into the halls of the manor that had been missing for far too long. Isabel, who had once been a quiet and withdrawn child, was beginning to flourish under Florence's care. The girl's smiles had become more frequent, her laughter more spontaneous. She had started playing with other children, something she had not done in years. And even Clement, though still carrying the weight of his grief, had allowed himself to be more present, more engaged in the lives of his children. The walls that had once separated him from his daughter were slowly crumbling, and he had begun to embrace his role as her father, no longer letting the shadow of his late wife's death dictate his actions. Florence, with her patience and unwavering support, had helped him reconnect with his family in a way he hadn't thought possible. But despite the growing sense of peace, there were still moments when Clement felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. He couldn't escape the lingering guilt that haunted him, guilt for not being there when his wife needed him, guilt for not fully seeing the pain his daughter had endured after her mother's death. He had buried those feelings deep inside, not daring to confront them. But now, with Florence by his side, those emotions began to surface. One afternoon, after Isabel had gone to her art lesson, Clement found himself drawn to the garden. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the stone pathways and the neatly trimmed hedges. It was a quiet, peaceful place, a place where he had spent many hours with his late wife. Caroline had always loved the garden. She had tended to the roses with great care, and it was there that she had spent the final days of her life, watching the flowers bloom while the fever took hold of her. It had been her sanctuary, and now it was his. Clement stood in the center of the garden, his gaze falling on the rose bushes that Caroline had so lovingly cultivated. The scent of the flowers was faint, but it stirred something in him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It was a mix of grief and longing, the kind of emotion that seemed too much to bear. He didn't hear Florence approach, but the soft rustle of the grass beneath her feet alerted him to her presence. She stepped up beside him, her gaze following his, her hand finding his in a quiet gesture of comfort. "Clement," Florence said gently, her voice a soothing balm to his troubled soul. "What's on your mind?" He took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm of emotions inside him. He had learned over the past few weeks that Florence had a way of drawing the truth out of him, even when he didn't want to face it. She could see through the walls he had built, and somehow that was both comforting and terrifying. "I've been thinking about Caroline," he confessed, his voice heavy with the weight of the words. "I've been thinking about how I wasn't there for her when she needed me most. I was away on business when she fell ill. I was so caught up in my responsibilities, my duties, that I didn't see how much she was suffering." Florence squeezed his hand gently, her fingers warm against his cold skin. "Clement, you did the best you could. You couldn't have known what would happen. You weren't to blame for her death." "I should have been there," Clement murmured, his voice thick with regret. "I should have been with her. I promised I would always protect her, but I failed." "I failed?" Florence took a step closer, her gaze fixed on him with quiet understanding. "You were not responsible for what happened, Clement. Grief has a way of making us blame ourselves for things that were beyond our control. But you are not alone in this. You have Isabel. You have me." Clement's heart tightened at her words, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he found comfort in the way she stood beside him, offering him her quiet strength. It was a strength he had come to rely on, even when he didn't understand how he could accept it. "I've spent so many years hiding from my own feelings," Clement said, his voice softening. "I thought that if I buried them deep enough, I wouldn't have to face the pain. But it's been there, festering inside me, and I didn't know how to deal with it. But you." He paused, taking a deep breath. "You've made me see that it's not about running away from the past. It's about learning to live with it, to move forward." Florence turned to face him fully now, her hand still holding his. "And you are moving forward, Clement, one step at a time. Isabel needs you, and so do I. We can't change the past, but we can create a future together." a future where we learn to live fully again. Clement nodded, his gaze softening as he looked into her eyes. For the first time in years he felt as though he could breathe again. The weight of his grief was still there, but with Florence by his side, it felt lighter. She had given him the gift of hope, the hope that perhaps he could find happiness again, despite the scars of the past. The following afternoon, as Clement watched from the doorway, he saw Florence sitting beside Isabel at the small wooden table in the nursery, a sketchbook open between them. Isabel's delicate fingers moved with surprising confidence, her charcoal pencil gliding across the page as she carefully worked on a drawing. Florence, ever the patient teacher, watched over her with gentle encouragement. Isabel had made remarkable progress in her lessons with Florence, not just in academics, but in learning to express herself through art. Clement had been astounded by her newfound passion for drawing, something that had not been part of her life before Florence's arrival. Florence was speaking softly to Isabel, her words encouraging but light, when Clement stepped into the room, clearing his throat to announce his presence. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his voice carrying a warmth he hadn't realized he had cultivated. Isabel looked up at him with wide eyes, her face lighting up with the first genuine smile he had seen in months. "Papa," she said softly, her voice shy but filled with joy. "Look, I've drawn Mama." Clement's heart skipped a beat. He walked over to Isabel's side, his gaze falling on the sketch she had created. It was a simple but poignant portrait of her mother, Caroline. The lines were soft but precise, and the resemblance to Caroline was unmistakable. It was a tribute to the woman they had both loved and lost. "That's beautiful, Isabel," Clement said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother would have been so proud of you." Isabel's smile widened, and Clement felt a pang of bittersweet sorrow. His daughter had been so closed off, so unreachable for so long. But now, with Florence's influence, she was slowly finding her voice again. She was healing, just as he was. Florence stood behind him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, a silent support as they both admired Isabel's work. "You've done something extraordinary, Isabel," Florence said, her voice filled with pride. "This is your way of honoring your mother, and that's a beautiful thing." Isabel's eyes shone with pride, but there was something else in them now, a spark of hope, of understanding that she could carry on her mother's legacy even without her. Florence had taught her that she didn't have to forget the past to live in the present. She could hold on to the memories of her mother while continuing to grow and thrive. As the weeks passed, Clement found himself growing more and more comfortable in his new role as a father. He had always been present in a formal sense, but with Florence's guidance, he was learning to connect with Isabel in a way he had never imagined. He had begun to play with her, to encourage her interests, and to share moments of joy that he had thought were lost forever. He had spent so many years hiding behind his title, using it as a shield to protect himself from the pain of loss. But Florence had helped him rediscover the man he once was, the man who could love, who could laugh, who could be vulnerable. He had opened his heart to her in ways he hadn't thought possible, and in doing so, he had begun to heal. The transformation was evident not only in his relationship with Isabel, but also in his relationship with Florence. They spent more time together, talking about their dreams for the future, their hopes, and their fears. Clement had come to realize that Florence wasn't just a governess to him, she was his partner, his confidant, and most importantly, the woman he loved. And as he watched Isabel grow more confident, more joyful, he knew that Florence had done more for them than he could ever have imagined. She had not just taught Isabel, she had taught him how to be a father again. She had healed their family, one day at a time, and now he could see a future that was filled with love and possibility. The day came when Clement realized he had finally become the man he had always wanted to be, the father, the husband, the man who could love again. And as he stood beside Florence in the garden, with Isabel's laughter echoing through the air, he knew that together they could face whatever the future held. "Thank you," he said softly, his hand finding hers once more, "for everything." Florence smiled, her eyes warm with understanding. "You don't have to thank me, Clement. I'm just doing what any family would do for one another." And in that moment, as they stood together in the garden that had once been a place of grief, Clement knew that their family was whole again. The wounds of the past had begun to heal, and in their place there was only love, love that had been rediscovered, love that had blossomed once more in the warmth of the present. 1 year had passed since Florence and Clement had exchanged vows beneath the warm glow of a quiet church, away from the pomp of the world's expectations. The summer sun bathed Ashford Hall in its gentle light as the estate flourished, much like the family that resided within its stone walls. The garden, which had once been a place of melancholy, was now alive with vibrant colors, roses climbing trellises, lavender swaying in the breeze, and the unmistakable scent of jasmine lingering in the air. The sound of laughter, once so rare within the halls of the Duke's home, echoed through the estate, filling the spaces with a warmth that only true healing could bring. Florence, now Duchess of Ashford, sat beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree in the garden, cradling their newborn son in her arms. Her dress, a soft shade of green that complemented the lush surroundings, fluttered lightly in the breeze as she gently rocked her son, a peaceful smile playing on her lips. The baby, nestled in the crook of her arm, cooed softly, his small fingers grasping at the fabric of her gown as his tiny eyelids fluttered shut. Isabel, who had grown into a bright, curious girl over the past year, sat nearby on a blanket spread across the grass, her once pale cheeks now radiant with health. She was reading aloud from a book of poetry, her voice soft but clear, as her younger brother, who had just begun to toddle around the garden, sat beside her, watching her with wide, admiring eyes. It was a moment of perfect tranquility, a stark contrast to the household's once sorrowful existence. Clement stood just a few feet away, his gaze fixed on his family. His broad shoulders, once hunched under the weight of his grief, were now relaxed, his posture no longer stiff with the weight of the title he had inherited, but never truly embraced. He no longer carried the heavy mantle of the somber Duke. The joy in his heart had finally found a place to settle, and Florence, the woman who had entered his life as a governess to his daughter, had become the cornerstone of everything he had learned to cherish. His eyes traced the familiar, loving contours of Florence's face as she looked down at their son, her expression one of utter devotion. There was no mistaking the depth of the bond they shared. Florence had not only healed Isabel and brought light back into the Duke's darkened heart, but she had transformed the very essence of their family. With each passing day, Clement realized just how much he had taken for granted, the simple joys of family, of love, of being present. For the first time in years, he was at peace. He no longer saw his late wife's memory as a shadow that loomed over his every action. Caroline's presence, though still cherished in his heart, had faded into a place of fond remembrance. It was Florence who had become his present, his future. As Clement continued to watch, a deep sense of gratitude swelled within him. He had come to understand the true meaning of love not as a fleeting emotion, but as an active, ongoing force that required nurturing, vulnerability, and, most importantly, trust. Florence had trusted him with her heart, with her past, and she had given him the gift of her unwavering devotion. He had done the same, and together they had created something more beautiful than either of them had thought possible a family. Clement sat down on the grass beside Florence, his heart swelling with pride and contentment as he watched Isabel's eager face lit up by the sunlight. She had grown so much in the past year, her once shy demeanor had been replaced by the confidence of a child who had learned to trust again, a child who had finally found a place to call home. Florence shifted their son slightly in her arms, her gaze meeting his. "Do you see them, Clement?" she asked softly, her voice warm with emotion. "Isabel is radiant. Look at how happy she is. Look at how she's grown." Clement nodded, his heart swelling as he watched his daughter, her once distant eyes now alight with joy. Isabel had flourished under Florence's care, learning to love again after so much pain. Her creativity and warmth were no longer buried under layers of grief and loss. They were free to flourish, just as they should have been all along. "I see it," Clement said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I see everything. I never thought I would find peace again after losing Caroline. I thought I was destined to carry that weight forever." He paused, his gaze fixed on their son, now peacefully sleeping in Florence's arms. "But then you came into my life, Florence, and you brought something with you that I had forgotten: joy. You reminded me that life doesn't stop just because we lose something precious. It goes on. And with you by my side, I've learned to live again. I've learned to love again. Everyone save well. Everyone save well." Florence's smile was gentle, her hand brushing a lock of hair from her face. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her eyes warm with affection. "We've learned together, Clement. You've helped me heal too. You've shown me what it means to be truly loved, and for that, I will be forever grateful." Clement wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close as he watched their children. The sight of them, Isabel reading to her brother, the baby cooing softly in Florence's arms, was a living testament to the healing that had taken place over the past year. It wasn't just Isabel who had healed. It was their whole family, and it was Florence who had brought them all back together. "I don't think I could have done this without you. Florence," Clement said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you've shown me what family is, and you've taught me how to be a father again. I've been blind to so much for so long, and I've been so afraid. But you've given me the courage to let go of the past and embrace the future. You've made me realize that I don't have to be perfect. I just have to love." Florence's eyes sparkled as she turned to face him, her gaze filled with tenderness. "You've always been enough, Clement. You've always been enough for me." For a long moment, they sat in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, but there was an unspoken understanding between them, an understanding that no words could fully capture. The past year had been transformative, and their lives had taken a turn they never could have anticipated. But in the quiet moments like this, as they sat together in the garden, surrounded by the sounds of their family and the beauty of the world around them, Clement realized that he had everything he needed right here. He had love, he had family, and he had hope. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Florence and Clement sat together on the stone bench under the oak tree. Isabel, now 9 years old, was sitting on the grass nearby, sketching intently in her notebook. Her pencil moved swiftly across the page, her brow furrowed in concentration. Clement watched his daughter, a sense of pride welling in his chest. Isabel's artistic abilities had blossomed in the past year, and Florence had encouraged her every step of the way. It was as though the heavy weight of her grief had finally lifted, and in its place, she had found a new outlet for her emotions. Florence had taught her that art was not just about what one could create with a pencil or a brush. It was about expressing the things that words could not. Isabel looked up from her notebook and smiled brightly at her parents. "Look, Papa," she said, running over to them, her eyes filled with excitement. "I've drawn a picture of us, all of us." Clement took the notebook from her, his heart swelling at the sight. Isabel had drawn their family himself, Florence their son, and even little Isabel, all holding hands beneath the tree. It was a simple drawing, but it captured something so pure, something that no artist could have ever fully conveyed with words. "This is beautiful, Isabel," Clement said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've captured our family perfectly." Isabel beamed, her face lighting up with pride. "I want to show Mama," she said, turning to Florence with eager eyes. Florence smiled, her heart full. "I think your papa is right," she said softly. "This is a wonderful drawing. It's a perfect picture of our family." Isabel's eyes brightened at the praise, and she hugged the notebook tightly to her chest. Clement watched the exchange with a deep sense of gratitude. It wasn't just the drawing that moved him, it was the fact that Isabel, who had once been so silent and withdrawn, had found her voice. She was no longer hiding behind her grief. She was embracing the joy that came with living again, just as he was. As the evening wore on and the children ran off to play, Clement sat back on the bench beside Florence. He gazed at the family he had once thought impossible to have, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and contentment. He had been a different man when Florence first arrived at Ashford Hall, a man weighed down by grief and regret, a man who had been unable to connect with his daughter or his own emotions. But now, with Florence by his side, he had rediscovered what it meant to be alive. He had rediscovered the joy of being a father and a husband. Florence, sensing the shift in his mood, turned to him with a gentle smile. "You're quiet, Clement. What's on your mind?" Clement looked at her, his eyes filled with affection. "I'm just thinking about how far we've come," he said softly. "A year ago this was all so impossible. I couldn't see beyond my grief. But now I have you, Florence. I have Isabel. I have a family. I've never been more grateful for anything in my life." Florence's smile deepened, and she reached out to take his hand. "We've both come a long way, Clement, and together we'll keep moving forward." Clement squeezed her hand gently, a quiet promise in his heart. "I will never take this for granted. I will never let go of what we've built." As they sat together under the oak tree, surrounded by their children, Clement finally understood what it meant to be whole again. He had hired Florence only to teach his daughter to read. Instead, she had taught them both to live again. If you enjoyed this heartfelt journey of love, healing, and family, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who could use a little inspiration. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new story that'll tug at your heartstrings. And leave a comment below what part of this story touched you the most. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care, and remember, sometimes the most unexpected people change our lives forever.